If you want to add an AI agent to your app, this is a simple way to do it. In this demo, I'm going to show you how to build a budget coach agent that can track finances using an existing API. So let's do I spent $250 on groceries today and had a coffee for $6 yesterday. Okay, so it's saying let's add these two transactions to your budget tracker. So $250 for groceries today, $6 on coffee yesterday. Please confirm. I'm going to say go ahead. So the transactions have been successfully added. Now I can say things like, am I over budget for today? So it's saying to check if you're over budget for today, I need to know your budget limits for today or the specific month. Do you want me to look for your budget? Yes, go ahead. Okay, for April 2026, here's your budget status for the food category. So I have $100 budget. I spent 256, which is what we just added. And for the remaining balance, I have a negative $156. So it's saying, yes, you are over budget, obviously, because I spent $156 that I shouldn't have. Now, obviously, this budget doesn't make sense. So I can say update the budget for food by $500, let's say. So it says, just to confirm, you want to make it 600, the current plus 500. I'm going to say yes. Okay, so it's been updated and I can ask the same question again. Am I over budget still? Okay, it says you are not over budget anymore. And as you can see, the budget here is now 600. The spent is the same. So the balance is now positive. Now that's pretty awesome. I'm going to show you exactly how this works behind the scenes and what's happening and how this AI agent is able to get this information from a real database. And a great way to understand exactly how this works is to go over this workflow. Okay, so the user message is what essentially we're typing in the chat UI, goes to the AI agent first, and then the AI agent checks if this requires changes in data. And if it does, it's going to go back to the user and ask for confirmation. When the user says yes, the app is going to call the database through services and it's going to execute the required operation to update or to retrieve information. And then the final answer is converted to a natural language in plain English, and then that's going to be returned to the user. That's basically how it works. But obviously, there are some things that we're going to go over in a few minutes that make this happen. So we're going to see services, we're going to see endpoints, and we're going to see how these are tied together and how the AI layer comes on top to achieve this exact scenario. Now, let's take a look at the project structure. So you have the basic .NET setup, but we're going to take a closer look at these specific folders. So we're going to see agents, contracts, data, endpoints, services, and www root. All right, so agents contains the AI agent logic and the tools it can call. Here we're going to define how the agent responds and which tools it can use. For this demo, we're going to create one simple agent here in budget agent, and we're going to create the necessary tools to manage budgets, transactions, and other queries. And we're going to set those up in budget tools. I just want to mention that it's important to keep the AI layer thin, which means that your agent shouldn't be doing math, database logic, validation, or things like that. Instead, these things should be handled directly in C# code. So the agent's main purpose is to handle chatting, explaining, summarizing, and deciding which tool to use for the job. So we're going to use contracts to define the request and response models used by the API. It's what defines the shape or the specific fields of the data going in and out into the API. We have 4 files here: chat request, chat response, create transaction request, and upsert budget request. We're going to take a closer look at each one in a few minutes. This folder data contains our models, and we have budget, budget transaction, and category. And we also have this budget DB context, which we're going to use to tie everything together. And we're going to use EF to do this. We also have a data seeder file, which we use to populate the database with some sample data. And essentially, anything that has to do with data is going to be under this folder. Inside of endpoints, we define the route mappings for the API endpoints, which means connecting each route to the code and service that handles it. In this case, we have agent, budgets, insights, and transactions. Services is one of the most important parts of this application or any application that uses this structure. That's because services contain the application logic for working with budgets, transactions, and insights in this case. It's what the API calls to do the actual work. So again, we set up services that handle the budgets, insights, and transactions. And we also have this month parser, which is a helper to make sure dates are formatted in a specific way that works across the board. Now, if you're a .NET developer, that's going to be obvious to you, but we're going to take a look at program.cs, which is used to wire everything together. Essentially, this is where we register the database, services, AI helper, and map the endpoints, basically connecting everything we saw earlier. And finally, and I'm not going to go deeper into this folder, but www.root contains the static front-end files for the demo chat UI, essentially what we saw at the start of the video. All right, let's take a look at our data folder. And I'm going to go here and let's open up our budget model. And just a reminder, I'm using SQLite for this app because it's tiny and good enough for a small demo like this one. So yeah, going back to budget, it's a pretty basic model. We have a unique ID. We have a month to set a budget for a specific month, a limit, which is the maximum spend for that month, and then a relationship with a category. Okay, next we're going to go to budget transaction. And also straight to the point, has an ID, date, amount, description, and a relationship to category. Say I spend $5 on an espresso today, the amount is 5, the description is espresso, and the category would be cafes or restaurants, whatever I have there. All right, next we're going to take a look at category. And here we also have an ID, a name, and a list of budget transaction, which is what we just saw. And we're calling that relationship transactions. So we can reference transactions from a category instance. Next, we have a list of budget, and we're calling that budgets. Then I'm going to go here to DB context. And here we're setting up some specific rules. And we're saying that a category name must be unique, for example. And then we're saying a budget must be unique per month and category. This means you can only have one budget for a given category in a given month. Now, for transactions, we're saying that we need to use a decimal value here. This is how we store money with 2 decimal places. So that's good for currency, and for budget limits, we're doing the same thing, just so our values are stored consistently. And finally, our data seeder, I'm going to go here, and we're using this to add these dummy values just when the database is empty. That way we have something to work with right away. So we're adding these budgets and these transactions here, and then we're just doing a save, changes a sync, which writes to the database. Okay, now let's talk about the services, which is the most important part of the app. And I'm going to go here to services, and I set up 3 simple services and 1 helper. I'm not going to take a look at month parser right now, but we might get to that later. So first we have our budget service, insight service, and transaction service. Okay, let's see what we have in our transaction service. And first you can spot that we have 5 methods here: add, get by month, get recent, get or create category, and delete. And you can probably guess what each one of those does. So let's take a look at each one. The first one, add a sync, does some basic validation here, but lets us add a new transaction to the database and then return a transaction view. Now, transaction view, if we go here, let me go down here. You can see that this is an ID, date, amount, description, and category. So this is how the values are returned. Next, we have get by month, and we pass in a specific month, and then we compute the start and end of that month and return a list of transactions for that specific month. Next, we have get recent, and we pass in a count value here. By default, this is 10. And this returns the most recent transactions for that specific count. You can say like return the most recent 50 transactions, and this is what that's going to return. Now, for the next one, we have get or create category, and this finds an existing category or creates it if it doesn't exist. Okay, so the last one is delete a sync, and we can pass a list of transaction IDs, and what's going to happen here is that we can remove the range of the provided IDs if we find them from the database. So these are the main functions or the only functions in our transaction service. Inside of Insight service, we have two methods. The first one is get monthly spend summary, and this one will return a total spending for the month plus a breakdown of spending per category for that month. We can see that we're returning a new monthly spend summary, which if we scroll down just a little bit here, we can see that this is the month, the total spent for that month, the number of transactions, and the breakdown by category, which is a category spend view, which in turn has a category name, the total, and the transaction count. So again, this method here is useful because we can get like a statement for that month with a breakdown by category. Next, we have get budget status, which returns the status for the budget. So for each budget for a month, how much was spent in that category and how much remains. Does that make sense? We pass in the month and then we're getting the budgets here. And then we return a budget status view, which is the month, the category, the budget for that month, how much was spent and how much is remaining. And this is very helpful when we want to see if we're still within budget for that specific month and do things similar to that. All right, now the last thing that I want to show you here is the budget service. And we have three methods: upsert, get by month, and get or create category. And the first one, upsert async, essentially creates a new budget or updates an existing one for a given month and category. And you can see here, we're checking if we have an existing one. And then if we don't have it, then we're creating a new budget or we're just updating the limit of an existing budget and we're saving to the database. Now, if we take a look at this upsert budget request, we can see that this method takes a month category and a limit. So we're searching for that and we're either updating or creating a new one. Okay, next we have get by month. And we pass in the month here as a string. And then for that month, we go and return all the budgets and we structure that in a budget view. So if we go here, or if I just hover on top of this, we can see that budget view includes the ID, the month, category, and the limit. Okay, next we have get or create category, and we pass the category name. So let's say we pass food, and then we can check if we can find food in our database. If it doesn't exist, we go ahead and create one and then return it. If it does exist, we just return it because it's there in the database. Okay, so we either get or create the category. Pretty simple, straightforward stuff. Let me just wrap up by saying that services are where the facts come from. So when the AI assistant wants to answer a question, it should only rely on these services to get the correct data. It doesn't matter how your app is structured, your own logic and functions should always be the source of truth for any AI agent because this prevents hallucinations and inconsistent answers. With that in mind, let's take a look at the tools which give the AI agent a safe way to call those services. So I'm going to go to Agents and I'm going to go to Budget Tools. And we can see that we have 6 methods here. And if we skim through the code super quick, we can see that each one of them is calling one of our services and then using the functions we saw earlier. So for instance, the get monthly spend is bringing in the insight service, and then we're using the get monthly spend summary to get those values here. The same thing here, we're calling get budget status, and then we're using the transaction service here to get the recent transactions. Get monthly spend gets the total spending for a month along with a breakdown by category. Get budget status gets each budget for a month, how much was spent and how much remains. List recent transactions. This will obviously list the recent transactions. Add transaction. Again, this is very obvious. It's going to add the transaction to the database using the service, not directly. But if you take a closer look at each one of these methods, because they're tools, you can see that we have descriptions. So for this one, we have a description of what it does and then a description for each field. So adds a new transaction to the budget tracker, positive amount spent, this is the amount, and then description, short description like groceries or coffee, etc. And these are super helpful because Microsoft Agent Framework uses these descriptions to make it more obvious to the agent what this tool does. So now the agent knows that add transaction does this, and then each field is or represents this specific description. So let's go next to delete transaction, and this removes one or more transactions by ID. And we saw how this is done using the transaction service. And finally, we have upsert budget. Again, we're using the budget service, and then we're calling the upsert method on that service. Okay, now let me show you what our actual agent, which is going to handle the chat, looks like. I'm going to go to budget agent, and as you know, I'm using Microsoft Agent Framework. So first thing, I'm bringing the AI agent class from the framework, and then I'm creating a temporary or a in-memory store for our sessions. We're going to use a unique ID for each session, and then the conversation is going to be stored as JSON. So next, we're creating our agent. And here I'm using OpenAI. You can use whatever you want. You can use a local model with Ollama if you'd like. That really depends on you. And then I'm saying that I want to use by default GPT-4o mini. And I'm storing these values in the user secrets because that's a safe place for a demo like this. It's always a good idea not to hard code those keys and keep them in a safe place instead. Next, I'm creating the OpenAI client, passing in the API key, and then I'm creating the actual agent. So I'm calling it budget coach, and then I'm providing the instructions. And I'm saying your helpful budget coach inside a budget tracker app. Today is the date time. I'm passing this because it helps the LLM know what today is. And if you don't do that, sometimes it confuses the current day. And I'm saying you have, abide by these rules. Use tools for financial facts. Never invent totals, budgets, or transactions. Keep replies short and practical. When the user asks about spending or budgets for a month, prefer this format. Ask for confirmation before changing data. And when a write action was requested, you may use the write tool and then confirm exactly what changed. Then I'm passing our tools, the ones we just saw. So we do that by saying AI function factory, create tools dot, and I'm just passing the list of tools here. So the agent calls the tool calls the service, and the service talks to the database. The AI never talks to the database directly, and that is the safest way to build this. All right, so now we have our agent, but we still need to handle the chats, right? So for each chat, we're going to store the conversation in a session. And to do that, we create this chat async method. And this takes in a session ID. So the chat request is made up of a session ID and a message. And the message is whatever we prompt the model. And then the session ID, we either provide it, or if it's not provided, it's going to be created by this function right here, as you can see. And then we're going to use this session key to store the conversation in memory in the session store that we saw earlier. So when a chat comes in, we take a look if the chat request has a session. And if it has a session ID, then we know that this chat is part of that conversation. But if it doesn't, we're going to create a new conversation. And then for subsequent messages, we're going to store the rest of the conversation under that session. Kind of like ChatGPT, when you're talking about different topics, you have the list on the left side. We have the same thing here. So that's stored in memory in session store, and we're using the session key as the key. Okay, now after the agent processes the response, we go and we return a chat response. The chat response has the session ID and then whatever the reply is. Okay, now let me show you the endpoints folder. And in our case, we have 4 files: agent, budgets, insights, and transactions. And obviously, since we're working with an API, we're going to need to expose some endpoints. Now, in the case of agent endpoint, we just have one HTTP post method, which is API agent chat. And we're expecting the user to send a chat request, which includes a session ID and a message. And next, we can use our agent here using dependency injection. We can call the chat async method and pass that request. And when we have an answer, we just return it as an HTTP 200 to the user. So yeah, we just need this one endpoint, and the magic is happening behind the scenes, right? So chat async will send this information to the agent, and it's going to know whether to use a tool or to just answer that question. And in the case of tool use, it's going to call that specific service, and then the service is going to go to the database, either fetch information or make a change and then update the user on what happened. Now, we also have other endpoints here like budgets, insights, transactions, and I'm sure in your API you also have many endpoints, but we're just focusing on the layer, which is the AI agent and how it's using the same services that other endpoints use to make the same kinds of changes, only using natural language instead of using HTTP calls like get, post, put, etc. So let's go and see our final file, which is program.cs. So if you're a .NET developer, you know that program.cs is where you configure your application and where you bring everything together. So in our case, I'm just going to show you that we're setting up our database here. We're bringing our services, transaction service, budget, insight, and then we have our budget tools and budget agent, and we're running our application. So I'm going to go back to the demo, and now you're going to understand just by looking at the chat exactly how this is working and what's happening behind the scenes. So let's do that. So yeah, now you know which tools this agent has access to, and you know which services are used and what are the capabilities of the services and what they can do with the database. And you also know that, for this particular chat, it's stored under this session ID, right? And then if we create a new chat, then so we're not going to pass the session ID now. And then our API is going to create a new session ID and store subsequent messages under that same session ID. So we can try something new like list the most recent transactions. And so in our case, we just have two. So now you know exactly how this works, right? The agent is looking at this query and then it's checking its tools. And based on the description of the tools, it knows that it needs to get the transactions. So it's going to call the transactions service. And in that case, specifically, we're calling the get recent transactions, which, if you remember, by default would pull 10 entries. But in our case, we just have two. So it returned this. Now, we saw other things like deleting a transaction. You can just say delete the coffee transaction. So yeah, as you can see, it's just confirming because we asked it to confirm before making any change. So just to confirm, you would like to delete the transaction for coffee ID 19. I'm going to say yes. And this is going to call the transaction service again. And then it's going to call the delete method and pass 19 as the transaction ID. Okay, I hope this video was helpful to you. If you have any questions, please let me know. And if you're working with Microsoft Agent Framework or some other framework that you'd like to see more videos about, do let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.